What does it mean when the most powerful country on earth says it is restoring deterrence and then a rocket lands inside its own embassy compound? That is not just another headline out of Baghdad. That is not just another flash of violence in a region already drowning in old wars and unfinished score settling. That is a symbol, a warning, maybe even a verdict. Because when a strike reaches the grounds of the US Embassy in Baghdad, at the exact moment Washington is projecting strength against Iran, the message is impossible to ignore. Something is not lining up. The official story says America is tightening the screws, re-establishing control, and forcing its adversaries to think twice. But the reality on the ground may be pointing in the opposite direction. The deeper America pushes, the closer the fire appears to be moving toward its own diplomatic, military, and strategic nerve centers. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. This is no longer just about airstrikes on Iranian-linked targets, or threats aimed at oil infrastructure, or the usual language of measured response and credible deterrence. This is about whether a campaign designed to contain escalation may actually be feeding it. It is about whether the machinery of pressure has moved past signaling and into something more unstable, more emotional, more combustible. Because once embassies, oil routes, proxy networks, and national prestige all get tied together inside the same crisis, miscalculation stops being a risk on the horizon. It becomes the atmosphere. To understand why this attack matters, you have to rewind the chain of escalation. Washington had already moved into a more aggressive phase, striking military-related targets on Iran's Karg Island, a location with enormous symbolic and strategic weight because of its connection to Iran's export lifeline. At the same time, Donald Trump was publicly signaling that if Tehran continued to threaten shipping and regional stability, even more critical Iranian oil infrastructure could become fair game. That is not routine rhetoric. That is the kind of statement that tells the region the red lines are shifting and the center of gravity is moving from indirect confrontation toward direct economic and strategic pain. On paper, this posture is supposed to produce clarity. Hit hard enough, threaten enough, and the other side recalculates. That is how deterrence is sold. It promises order through fear. But the Middle East has a long history of turning that logic inside out. Pressure does not always create silence. Sometimes it creates improvisation. Sometimes it fragments command. Sometimes it pushes responses into places where the attacker is least comfortable. And that is exactly why Baghdad matters so much. A strike inside the grounds of the US Embassy is not simply a tactical incident. It is a strategic statement that says, your pressure campaign does not exist in a sealed military lane. It can be answered in political space, symbolic space, diplomatic space. That is where the contradiction begins to sharpen. The official narrative coming from Washington is one of command, resolve, and escalation dominance. But if America is dominating the ladder of escalation, why is one of its most important diplomatic compounds in the region coming under direct fire? If the goal was to force opponents into caution, why are the most politically loaded American sites now looking exposed? If the point was to contain the battlefield, why does the battlefield suddenly seem to be spreading toward exactly the places Washington most needs to protect? And this is where Baghdad becomes more than a rock. Baghdad becomes a mirror. It reflects the entire structure of this crisis back at the people running it. The US Embassy there is not just an office. It is one of the clearest symbols of American power, presence, and ambition in the post-2003 Middle East. It sits inside a country where Washington and Tehran have spent years wrestling through proxies, influence operations, militias, state institutions, and political pressure. Iraq is not neutral terrain. It is overlapped territory. It is the place where American force projection and Iranian strategic depth have collided for years in messy, deniable, ambiguous ways. So when a rocket hits the embassy compound, the meaning travels far beyond the blast zone. It says the overlap is breaking down. It says the old buffers may be thinning. It says the distinction between military pressure and political exposure is eroding. And it raises an uncomfortable possibility that nobody in Washington wants to admit out loud. Maybe the campaign is not restoring deterrence at all. Maybe it is inviting challenges designed to prove that deterrence is incomplete. That possibility becomes even more serious when you look at the warning signs that came before the strike. This did not happen in a vacuum. The US Embassy in Baghdad had already been issuing repeated security alerts in early March, warning of ongoing threats to American interests and citing reports involving missiles, drones, and rockets in Iraqi airspace. Regular consular services were suspended. The message was clear long before the attack itself. The environment was deteriorating. Threat indicators were rising. The system was under stress. That matters because it changes the story from random shock to accumulated pressure. This was not a bolt from a clear sky. It was the visible break in a pattern that had already been tightening. In other words, the embassy strike may not be the beginning of a new phase. It may be the first undeniable image of a phase that was already underway. And that is a much darker reading because it suggests this crisis has been broadening faster than the public story has admitted. Once you see it that way, the attack starts to look like more than retaliation. It starts to look like a message aimed at the architecture of American strategy itself. Not just we can hit back, but we can hit where your strategy becomes politically uncomfortable. Military targets are one thing. Diplomatic compounds are something else. They carry prestige, credibility, and optics. They trigger questions in Washington that airstrikes on remote positions do not. They force officials to answer not just whether they can strike, but whether they can protect. And that is exactly where deterrence can start to unravel in the public mind. Because deterrence is not only about what your enemy fears, it is also about what your allies believe and what your own public is willing to accept. If embassies, bases, and strategic corridors all begin to look vulnerable at once, then the image of control weakens. Allies start wondering whether America's campaign is stabilizing the region or exposing it. Regional governments start asking whether they are being shielded or quietly placed on the front line. Markets start asking whether oil and shipping are next, and adversaries or forces aligned with adversaries start seeing openings where they previously saw a risk. That is why the next development is so important. Washington did not respond to this environment by narrowing the confrontation. It reinforced its posture. Reports pointed to the movement of additional U.S. military assets into the region, including thousands of Marines and the USS Tripoli. At the same time, Iranian messaging indicated that if critical oil infrastructure came under attack, energy-related assets tied to the United States across the region could become targets as well. This is the part where the story becomes much bigger than Iraq or even than the embassy strike itself, because once oil infrastructure enters the equation, the crisis moves into the bloodstream of the global economy. Karg Island is not just another target, it is deeply tied to Iran's energy lifeline. Threats against it are threats against export capacity, state revenue, and strategic leverage. And if Tehran signals that energy-linked retaliation could spread across the region, then the war map expands immediately. Suddenly, the relevant geography is not just Baghdad or southern Iran. It is the Gulf. It is shipping lanes. It is tanker insurance. It is refinery risk. It is the psychology of traders and governments watching for the next move. This is where the hidden consequences begin to outweigh the visible ones. A rocket into an embassy compound is dramatic, but the larger danger is that it becomes one tile in a broader mosaic of pressure and counterpressure that neither side fully controls. The public sees isolated events. A strike here, a warning there, a deployment somewhere else. But under the surface, those events may be joining into a system. And systems are what create spirals. That spiral could take shape in several ways. One possibility is that each side keeps operating in the language of calibrated pain. America hits but avoids the most catastrophic targets. Iran or Iran-linked actors answer, but stop short of mass casualty attacks that would force a massive US reply. The violence continues, the messaging continues, the fear continues, but everyone tries to remain one step below regional war. That is the optimistic reading, if there is one. But the darker possibility is that the very effort to stay below the threshold becomes what drives the conflict wider. Because when states and proxies are all trying to signal resolve without crossing the final line, they often reach for politically loaded but deniable targets: embassies, shipping, contractors, energy facilities, airspace harassment, cyber pressure. The point is not to win outright. The point is to make the other side feel vulnerable. And when both sides are doing that at once, the threshold does not stay stable. It gets slippery. That is why this story has such strong political weight. On television, pressure campaigns are sold as proof of leadership. They are packaged into slogans about strength and order. But in reality, the politics of force in the Middle East are brutal because outcomes do not obey speeches. You can project confidence and still produce exposure. You can hit first and still end up reacting. You can claim to be restoring deterrence and still watch the conflict creep toward your own diplomatic walls. And for Donald Trump, or for any American administration in a moment like this, that contradiction is especially dangerous, because the domestic political value of a hard line depends on the perception that it works. If the public sees American action followed by apparent American vulnerability, the narrative begins to wobble. What was sold as dominance begins to look like drag. What was framed as control begins to look like entanglement. What was supposed to be a demonstration of strength starts raising the oldest and ugliest question in American Middle East policy. Are we shaping events, or are events dragging us into another expanding cycle we cannot fully command? That question does not stay in Washington. It lands hard in Iraq too. Baghdad is forced into an impossible position whenever US-Iran tensions spike on its soil. The Iraqi state has to navigate pressure from Washington, pressure from armed groups, pressure from Tehran, and pressure from its own internal political factions. Every attack on a US target inside Iraq is not just a blow against America. It is also a reminder of how fragmented Iraqi sovereignty remains in moments of regional confrontation. It exposes the gap between formal authority and operational reality. It puts Iraqi leaders in the humiliating position of hosting one power while struggling to prevent another network from using Iraqi ground as message space. That has consequences for alliances across the region. Gulf states, already anxious about missile threats, shipping disruption, and blowback from a wider US-Iran clash, have to watch this and wonder how quickly they could become part of the same story. If American diplomatic compounds and strategic interests are under pressure in Baghdad, while Washington is openly threatening Iranian oil infrastructure, then no major regional asset tied to the United States can feel fully insulated. The anxiety spreads outward. That is how crises travel in this region, not always through formal declarations of war, but through widening circles of uncertainty. And ordinary people do not get spared just because the language is strategic. If this crisis deepens, the consequences will not remain trapped inside security briefings. Energy markets are exquisitely sensitive to perceived risk in the Gulf. Shipping costs can rise before a major disruption even happens, simply because insurers and operators price in fear. Import costs feel the pressure. Fuel prices react. Inflation expectations react. Investors respond to instability long before governments admit that instability has become structural. That is why this story matters even to viewers far from Baghdad. What happens around Iranian oil infrastructure, Iraqi airspace, and US diplomatic sites can move the cost of daily life in countries that will never appear in the military communiques. One rocket in a diplomatic compound does not by itself rewrite the global economy. But when it arrives inside a broader pattern of military escalation, oil threats, and regional military deployments, it feeds a climate of risk, and risk is expensive. There is also a human meaning behind all of this that gets buried under the language of deterrence. Every time officials describe these steps as calibrated, they imply that violence remains manageable. But what manageable often means in practice is that civilians, workers, diplomats, transport crews, and families are forced to live inside a permanently electrified atmosphere, one in which normal life depends on whether armed actors choose restraint for another 24 hours. That is not stability, that is suspended catastrophe. So where does this go next? One path is the contained spiral. In that version, the embassy strike is treated by Washington as a serious warning but not a trigger for a drastic leap. The United States continues to posture, continues to threaten, perhaps continues selective action, but avoids the kind of attack on Iranian oil infrastructure that would almost guarantee a regional energy shock. Tehran, or forces aligned with it, continue to probe and pressure, but stop short of mass casualty actions that would close off deniability. The region remains tense, ugly, and unstable, but the fire is managed at the edges. The problem with that path is that it depends on discipline from actors who are operating under fear, prestige pressure, and incomplete information. It depends on nobody making a mistake, nobody improvising beyond instructions, nobody misreading a signal, nobody trying to restore lost credibility through one dramatic act. The second path is much darker. In that version, the embassy strike is not the warning shot before restraint. It is the opening image of a broader phase in which symbolic targets become fair game, oil becomes an active lever, and the distinction between diplomatic pressure and regional warfare erodes even further. One side decides that not responding forcefully would look weak. The other side decides that backing down would invite more pain. Proxy action widens. Military deployments thicken. Shipping risk jumps. Energy infrastructure moves closer to the center of the conflict. And suddenly the question is no longer whether the crisis can be controlled, but whether anyone still has the authority to control it. That is the real danger here. Not a single strike, not a single speech, not a single deployment. The danger is the pattern forming between them. A pattern in which every move presented as stabilizing may actually be making the environment more combustible. A pattern in which deterrence, that favorite word of powerful states, starts to produce the opposite of what it promises. Because in the end, this is the image nobody in Washington can easily explain away. America says it is restoring order, and then a rocket lands inside the grounds of its embassy in Baghdad. That does not automatically prove the strategy has failed, but it raises the possibility that something deeper is going wrong, that the campaign is not closing space for retaliation, but redistributing it. That pressure is not forcing surrender, but pushing responses into places of maximum political discomfort. That what is being built here is not a clean demonstration of power, but a wider system of vulnerability. And once that system takes shape, it becomes much harder to reverse than to ignite. So now the real questions begin. If deterrence is working, why are America's own diplomatic symbols moving closer to the blast zone? If this pressure campaign is meant to contain the conflict, why does the map of risk keep widening from military targets to embassies, oil routes, and regional alliances? And if the next phase puts energy, diplomacy, and civilian economic life under the same shadow, who exactly will be able to say this strategy brought stability instead of something far more dangerous?